George Dreyfus is going to be here to give a talk on November the 15th. And at Paul's prodding, or whatever, suggestion, or reminder, I called George, and he said he'd be most willing, to talk about, the usage of words like Chittamatra, Yogācara, Madhyamaka, Great Madhyamaka, in Sakya. I don't know if any other systems in Tibet. And he said he couldn't deliver a be-all, end-all lecture on it, but he could talk some on it. And then if all of us responded with questions and discussion, then he could, we could have a good time. So Asaṅga's grounds of bodhisattvas, his bodhisattva-bhūmi. One thing Tsong-kha-pa is doing is pointing out that Asaṅga argues against Madhyamakas, or ni-svabhavavadins, ngōnyimebama. And thus, as I've said before, I think an implicit message is that mind only and Madhyamaka can't be mixed in all respects. It's not to say that certain topics like calm abiding, the 5 paths, the 10 bodhisattva grounds are not similar. You have to be skilled in figuring out what's the same and what's different. But with respect to what the middle is, the proper view, the proper perspective, the proper estimation on the way things actually are, there's a profound controversy. And thus, it raises questions. What Tsong-kha-pa is doing, I think, is to try to make it impossible for there to be an eclectic amalgam of the two systems. Although, and that means if you're sticking to Asaṅga and Chandrakirti, because Chandrakirti argues against, and Asaṅga argues against, they're not contemporaneous, Chandrakirti being afterwards. But you have in both Chandrakirti and in Asaṅga, you have clear arguments against those respective views. And over again, Tsong-kha-pa is making the case that in Yogācara, or mind only, the statement that in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that Chirtamche ngōnyimekwa magyeba magakwa samana shiwa yongsu nyangan le debaho, that is not to be taken literally, that it's to be broken down into the ngōnyisum and the ngōnyimebasum. And so he's over and over again proving this. And I think in the background, he doesn't, having done this work on Wangchu, he doesn't bring up the Jonangbas. Well, I don't know how often he does. He brings them up quite frequently, but he doesn't bring it up every time he's making the point. And therefore, their synthesis is wrong. He does it implicitly. And he does a beautiful job of that. I would add that it would be fine to say, well, I'm not using Asaṅga and Chandrakirti as my sources, but I'm creatively taking some of all of their material and putting it together and finding out what I could come up with that was original, which is, of course, you can't say. having always to claim that this is Buddhist teaching, whatever. So, very interesting things are done there. He had a very interesting, I'd say really, revelation of somebody's view, that this would be the best way to describe it. So Shirab Khyentse, and we'll talk more about him later, was so important in the 14th century, and Tsong-kha-pa took a different tack. All right, it's all stuff I've said before. So there are the two extremes, and Tsong-kha-pa puts off discussing the extreme of superimposition until chapters 10 and 11, actually. And talks mainly about the extreme of deprecation in these chapters. So really the punch, what the punch against the innate conception that comes in chapters 10 and 11, really in 10, the punch. So sort of the, what do you say, the people don't, sentient beings don't innately fall to the extreme of deprecation. And that's why Tsong-kha-pa says it's the nisvabhavadins who do this. You see, it's a system. They study, but of course, that means then a lot of sentient beings who study such and such a philosophy, maybe not necessarily nisvabhavadins, but perhaps anyway, any 20th century philosopher who's trying, I'm not saying all, but any of those who attempt to show that phenomena have no essence. That's Foucault. Just about everybody.
Foucault said that.
Well, Foucault, Derrida, go back. Anyway, now essences would mean one way of looking at it. You see, one way that I throw back in the face of Buddhologists or Tibetologists or Gelugpaologists, and they think that Gelugpa Madhyamaka is so much like, is so anti-essentialist. I say, well, Tsong-kha-pa holds that each phenomenon has its own definition, and what are you going to do with that? The argument about emptiness is not made on the line that, give me a definition of rock, and I'll show you something that's a rock that we have to call rock. That doesn't fit your definition. Do you follow? That's not what's done in Nagarjuna's treatise. He analyzes, for instance, with regard to motion, the area where it takes place. Does it take place on the area already gone over? Does it take place on the area being gone over? Does it take place on the area yet to be gone over? And he has reasons for all three not working. Then he analyzes motion with respect to who's going. Does a goer go? Does a non-goer go? Is there a third? Something other than a non-goer and a goer? And he analyzes it with respect to, these are separate analyses that are sufficient in itself to show that you cannot, under this type of analysis, find something like going, which means then any action. And he analyzes where does going be, who begins going? A goer or a non-goer? That one you can sort of tune into right away. Why would a goer begin going if the person's already gone? And how could a non-goer begin going? You say, you know, what's the next topic? Let's go out for ice cream.
Are you thinking of Parmenides?
Yes, very much so. Parmenides does very similar things. And anyway, there's these sorts of analyses. It doesn't posit a definition. Nagarjuna himself doesn't posit a definition and then see, oh, well, he does discuss the relationship between definitions and the objects defined. You see, as I did with my hands, definition and the object defined. The definition is the defining character of the object, right? So it may appear to thought to be separate, but it isn't separate. But he doesn't do this by way of, you know, trying to find a definition for human and positing several and not being able to come up with any. And, however, a very interesting point, I think, is that in the debating courtyard, this is exactly what's done. They try to make a mess out of any definition, right? To the point where people are so confused they can't practice Dharma. Or begin practicing worldly rituals for fame, wealth, and protection. Really, it's a big problem. Once you go into things in such detail, you lose them. Even though, in fact, by going in detail, you are putting yourself within the architecture of the system, you lose sight of that and you get caught, you know, in the trees rather than being able to take a look at the woods. Some people do. And they start thinking, well, it's just hopeless. It's hopeless. You can't figure these things out. Or they say things like, well, the great ones in the past figured them out, and it's just not approachable to people with our low intellects. Well, you know, that's cute, but, you know, that's one way of giving up and maintaining some sort of blind faith, I guess. And I don't know, I think a way to get around it is just to insist on being practical and also going into all the problems. And, but it's, the debating courtyard teaches you just what these European and American philosophers are claiming. That phenomena don't have any set defining characteristics. Now sometimes people say, oh, what essences mean is some permanent essence, you know? And so then I say, what do you mean by permanent? Well, you know, it tends to them to mean one that's true of every one of these objects, you see? So for instance, the definition of person, kansa, is pungbo shiam nala tene takbe natsam. This is in Prasangika. The mere I that is designated in dependence upon either 4 or 5 aggregates. 4 in the formless realm, 5 in the form and desire realms. And that's that's what it means to be a person. And frankly, I don't know how that definition is challenged. And of course, then when you say all phenomena have definitions, actually I should have extracted it. You know, you come up with very difficult to give a definition of gabum. You know, gabum kitsenyi sho. And I think Jigme Tamsha Gyatso had a way of dealing with this. And that was cute. But anyway. All right. How did I get off on this topic? Definitions?
What is life?
Really? Oh, yes. And so challenging those people who see in Gelugpa scholarship just this topic that they find to be so fruitful in European and American philosophy. Just as I read into Buddhist practices some of the insights of psychoanalysis that for me are so vital and important, and I want the system to have them. But this causes me to disregard a lot of evidence, and but I think it can be read into tantric practices, although it develop theories like as there are in psychoanalysis, you don't get, but you get practices, I think, that are acting them out. Then, so I wanted to take that one step back on how we got off, extreme of deprecation. Oh, that it's only from systems, scripture or systems, that one gets into deprecation. Denying that other powered natures exist by way of their own character. Now, we know a lot of people who do that, even Buddhists, or denying that phenomena perform functions or whatever. By having learned, this is from Tsong-kha-pa's perspective, that would be a deprecation, that denying that impermanent things perform functions, right? But a lot of people, after studying Buddhist texts like, the Heart Sutra, Sukme, Jame, Chime, Rome, Rekjame, draw the conclusion that form doesn't exist, sounds don't exist, etc. And therefore there couldn't possibly be any performance of function. So even though it's said, he says, that the extreme of deprecation is done by nisvabhavavadins, and I would think nihilists too, but probably he would say that they're not denying that these objects that we see exist by way of their own character. They're denying things like cause and effect of karma. Even those who achieve great meditation and see back a certain number of lifetimes, and not enough to see that 40,000 lifetimes ago you did something that still needs to bear fruition and is doing so now. It can't get back far enough. It's also convenient too, but I suppose it might be the truth too. So, I wonder if most of us have the extreme of deprecation. We've been to school so long. We certainly have the extreme of from some of this point of view, right? The extreme deprecation with regard to certain topics, no question. But with regard to other powered natures, that means this stuff existing by way of its own character. Many of us might, from having studied Buddhism, Buddhist texts, or Nietzsche, or
Right.
I'm getting close to, but
Wittgenstein?
yes, Wittgenstein. That's who I wanted. He's the favorite that some people want to accord with and see Buddhism and him going the same way. In some way it may, but it's more complex than people think. Much more, I think. So, and you may have to turn to non-Gelupa presentations of Madhyamaka to find something that would accord more with Wittgenstein, where under analysis the actual object is being refuted rather than just its inherent existence. So, in chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, he's, well, I don't, no, I can't say that. In some of these chapters, he's pursuing the extreme of deprecation. All right. One of the distinctions that Tsong-kha-pa makes in the first bullet is that Asaṅga speaks of the nature of imputational words. And you see, most people think that the object of negation is words. The object of negation is language, right? And in fact, if they understand Yogācara well, they think that, and they also automatically think this with regard to Madhyamaka. It's words. And so, and the meaning that they often give is that the names of objects are arbitrary, and that they assign as the meaning of Madhyamaka. And if they know Yogācara a bit, you know, the early Yogācara that speaks in the way Asaṅga does, they assign that meaning to this too. But in fact, the knowledge that terms are arbitrary doesn't get anybody out of cyclic existence in anybody's system. Great Exposition, Sutra School, Mind-Only School, Middle Way School, or naturelessness school. But none of them. It is a topic that terms are arbitrary, because in the cultural context, well, I think especially in India, where Sanskrit, even for Buddhists, is a divine language, and it's like the real words for things, you know, as if, you know, going is to be called dung. And that, I mean, that's the real word for it. Buddhists, you know, when you're repeating mantra and so forth, they have then a problem because they don't accept that words are inhere in the objects. And yet, in doing mantra, you've got to do the syllables just right and so forth. In Sanskrit. And as Guntang says, you have to think of the meaning as you recite them. That's the difference for a Buddhist. It's not that the meaning automatically is there. That's what you see. He has to counter with that at least claim in order to maintain consistency. And I'd say on top of it, something like Omarabhajanadi, the sounds, those particular sounds, you know, they're sharp, they're like, and then of course after it you're saying and the whole pattern of it, I think itself increases intelligence. Ability to speak and increases intelligence, the sounds themselves. And I don't think that means that Arabhajana inheres in Manjushri as his name. It means that the sounds are fabulous sounds for getting your brain and whatever else going. And then beyond that, I think that in any culture, with any language, with anyone's first language probably, there's a strong tendency to feel by most people that this is what it's called. That all of us or most of us to a certain extent have to be broken out of that. I've told you the story myself of deciding as a kid that, well, if it's going to be a table, then it's only going to be a table. And that was a huge obstacle to my being able to speak other languages, even though I could learn, so to speak, how to write them and read them, so forth, very well. You know, I had to some point give up that it was really a semi-conscious decision that I made as a child. Now, whether it's semi-conscious or unconscious or conscious, probably goes along with most of us. So the fact that you don't get out of cyclic existence by realizing the arbitrariness of terms, we wrote on the blackboard earlier, right? Durgyal-kija. Did we do it? Durgyal-kija? We didn't? Terms in which one's wish is like supreme or the ruler. Mm-hmm. You know. Then, so, you see, I think it's very important in the process of determining the realization of which gets you out of cyclic existence, not to think that, well, these other things aren't important, because they'll serve as primary obstacles to being able to get at the deeper topics, if they really are deeper topics, and unless one takes care of the so-called smaller issues, which really are in a way bigger because they're blocking the whole way, it's impossible. So one of the pitfalls of learning tenets is that you get the whole structure and you'll be talking about these the 10th Bodhisattva ground and Buddhahood as if we were on the side of Buddhahood and, you know, talking about it. But it just takes a practicality and to know that you're somebody whose mind is distracted.
I have a question about how it is that separating emptiness and wisdom, like we've seen in this presentation, helps one to get out of cyclic existence. What the purpose of that is in relation to that.
I think for somebody who's newly approaching emptiness, to think that this has an emptiness, that has an emptiness, that has an emptiness, this has an emptiness, this has an emptiness, as a marvelous quality of it, and that I am conceiving the opposite. You see, you're able to approach it a little bit like over there, even though in the end it's not going to be like over there. And then you're able to think about reasonings that show that the object is not established by its own character as the referent of conceptuality or of terms. And look at the reasonings, which we haven't done yet. And as an approach to get in it, it's very powerful, I think. One way, because it's using conceptuality against conceptuality, rather than putting your mind in a state and then in a very interesting state. I mean, you can do that. But then you come out of it and it doesn't have that much effect on what you're seeing because you haven't you know, I don't want to say burned up, but you haven't burned up a little of the conceptual mind. It's like working in the conventional world. It's like you've given up, and it's like working in stupidity. But that's not the case. I mean, you can work in the so-called conventional world with wisdom. And so as an approach, it's very helpful. And thus, that's the reason why whoever it was said that Gelug is looking at things from the point of view of the ordinary state. And that doesn't mean just ordinary beings. It means somebody who is initially setting themselves up for practice and beginning practice. Whereas like Nyingma and I would think Gagyu is from more, well, Nyingma, Gagyu usually say is so strong on practice. Although I think this is so strong, the Gelugpa one is so strong on a certain type of practice. And that Nyingma is more like trying to pull you into the effect state. So it strikes me that all of these have a place, and that using the one with the other is can be tremendously helpful. That's just how it strikes me. And then it's essential to remember that even in Gelugpa, the emptiness of things and the wisdom realizing it is described as like water in water when you get it. And I think it's helpful then to see the problems that come from making them separate and the problems that come from making them together. And I'm getting very practical and not worrying about it. Not worrying about the problems, taking it as two sides of the coin. So then, one of the fascinating features of Tsong-kha-pa's text is the cryptic nature of it. And how when people search into it, they find meaning in some place where, you know, he has summarized something to the point where you can't understand what he's getting at, but you look at the sources and so forth, and you can figure it out. And then that leads you into thinking you can figure out everything. And so here where he says on, you know, like pages, whatever it is, he quotes the chapters, you know, he uses the plural, leuna. And, well, sometimes it can be seen as plural chapters, and other times it's like somebody who didn't check out what they were doing and slipped up, and there weren't plural chapters on that topic. There was only one. And so then the commentator, to make Tsong-kha-pa sound right, says it means the whole chapter. The plural means the whole chapter, which is a bit pressed. I think if I was pressed in debate, I would say, oh, you know, sometimes the plural ending is used for an honorific in Sanskrit. And it's that way in translations into Tibetan. You know, make some elaborate thing. And that occasionally it's used that way. And that's his meaning here, etc. But you see, people are drawn into digging because when they dig on the other topics, they're so rich. And, you know, it sounds as if he may have slipped up. Then the grounds of bodhisattvas. So you notice he turns the topic immediately to deprecation. How to refute views that superimpose or deprecate. Then he, in the second paragraph, he says that the extreme superimposition is refuted, blah, 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 by, and this will be explained in detail later. So then, Asaṅga himself does not speak of autonomous and consequentialists, and as the notes point out, at that time, well, never mind the fact that autonomy school and consequentialist school, consequent school, these names were formulated in Tibet. So of course Asaṅga didn't use them. At Asaṅga's time, Chandrakirti was yet to come. Bhava-viveka was yet to come. So, but to whom do these debates apply if they're applying to Nisvabhavavadins? And so what's being said is that there were followers of Nagarjuna and the literal teaching of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras around at that time. And would they only be of a consequentialist mode, even if they weren't calling themselves that, or would they be in the autonomy mode also? And it seemed sensible that it would be both, unless you claimed that the autonomy school tradition began, I mean the founder is Bhava-viveka, but that it began with Bhava-viveka, that there weren't others preceding it. Buddhapalita, you see, is Chandrakirti comes to the defense of him, and that it was in reaction to the consequentialist commentary by Buddhapalita that Bhava-viveka established a different view. But in another way, since in India, it seems people didn't recognize the difference between the autonomy and consequent schools. Oh, you know, for instance, as I said earlier, Avalokitavrata, who wrote a very extensive commentary on Bhava-viveka, Bhava-viveka's Madhyamaka Hridaya. Very extensive, extremely extensive. He clearly, of course, understood that Bhava-viveka was rejecting Buddhapalita, but he did not understand that Chandrakirti had a different view on emptiness from that of Bhava-viveka. He certainly would have known, because Chandrakirti mentions Bhava-viveka and refutes him on some points, but he didn't draw the conclusion that Tsong-kha-pa did, that these are different systems. So now you see, in the wording of Asaṅga's remarks, you know, do they cover both what turned out to be autonomy and consequentialist, or is it just consequentialist? And you can run those many different ways. Well, certainly have to include the consequentialists. Could also include the autonomous, right? There's not many ways. Nobody says it's just autonomous. Now, other powered phenomena have to have their own nature, and thus, you know, Chandrakirti is unwilling to accept that other powered phenomena are just conceptually imputed. Which shows his disagreement. Then, for next time, and if you have any discussion on this, please raise it. I don't mean to jump too quickly. You know, sometimes it seems to me that at this point it's obvious, but it just plain isn't obvious. Was everything lucid as you read this? Lucid? No.
I mean, it's still very committed to memory, but the writing is clear. You have to read it a couple more times.
Oh yeah, isn't it like that? And it's so much. You know, it's like you have to have it in front of you all of the time. You know, if you ask me what some of these things, I'd say, well, yeah. sort of remember, let me think about that for a day. So, for next time, Asaṅga's compendium of ascertainments, both in the, in the two parts, the synopsis. Okay.